Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends. And if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you hog smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page, where you can get access to behind the scenes info, updates, uncut interviews, exclusive content, merchandise discount codes, and even a personal shout out on the channel. If Patreon isn't your thing, have no fear. I also have a Ko-Fi page where you can support the channel, and there's also links to JerkComic shirts and tons of other merch in the description below. Thanks to everyone who's already signed up, donated, or ordered a shirt. I cannot tell you all how much I appreciate it. But now it is trivia time. While there's been a good bit of shakeup surrounding the casting of the long-awaited adaptation of Neil Gaiman's magnum opus Sandman, I don't usually pay much mind to such things. I often joke about it, but I do honestly feel like keeping up with the growing number of movies and television adaptations is a young man's game, and honestly, I usually don't have a horse in the race. Anyways, I'm not slavishly tied to source material, but I do sense a general lack of understanding and a fundamental lack of respect for the source material, and enough of the stuff coming out, I just can't bring myself to care that much these days. Some of it's good, some of it's great, some of it's bad, and a lot of it is just forgettable. I've had to divorce myself from comic media and comic books. They're just different beasts, and I tend not to invest my time or energy into getting angry or excited about them. The Sandman series is a rare exception to me, though. And the recent hubbub about the casting of Death did manage to briefly catch my eye. Few other comic characters have managed to reach the level of cultural proliferation that Sandman's Death has, and far fewer still are those that originate from comics in the past few decades. First appearing in the 8th issue of Sandman, Death would go on to become not only perhaps the most popular character in Sandman, despite the series being about her brother and fellow member of the Endless, Morpheus, but a cultural icon for generations to come. Her disarming, demure appearance in the original Sandman comics shows a snowflake white woman bereft of ethnicity and possessing what I consider to be the Mona Lisa smile of comics. In Death, Mike Dringenberg managed to capture all that men fear in a physical vessel and somehow transform that into a disarmingly interesting and beautiful visage. It is worth noting that if you've actually read Sandman, then you know this is simply how some people perceive her, though. Death's appearance is supposed to be whatever that particular person needs or wants to see at that moment. Even her gender seems to be a rather subjective notion, to say the least. So while it is kind of a shame to lose one of the most iconic comic book character designs ever, really, not only is it not much of a stretch, but I think Death would have been okay with it. You see, while there might have been a mini-series about the girl who would be Death, once upon a time there was a girl who was Death. She was an unendingly humble person, a dancer, a model, a squatter, a fashion designer. To some she was a muse, and to others simply bemusing, but according to everyone who ever met her, she was an infinitely interesting human being. And tonight, I wanted to share her story with you all. Not because I'm angry or because I disagree with the casting decision in any way. I just think that her story deserves to be heard, and she was far too humble a human being to tell it while she was alive. So let's take a few minutes to learn, reminisce, and remember the girl who was Death. Cinnamon Hadley. While details about her life are spotty at best, and she's far from what I would call a traditional celebrity, Cinnamon Hadley seems to have been at the center of nearly every artistic community she was ever involved with from an extremely early age. There was an undeniable majesty to Hadley who's still fondly remembered today wherever she went, even more than a decade after her passing. She was especially active and influential in her hometown stomping grounds of Salt Lake City and the surrounding Utah area after leaving California, where she was born at a fairly young age. Hadley was involved with the fashion, art, and dancing communities specifically, though it seems that if anyone was doing anything, even approaching art, near or around her, they somehow were pulled into her gravitational field and ended up having some sort of interaction with her. Cinnamon Hadley was an ardent believer in the notion of artistic communities, and Hadley, community meant support and kinship. Her home was always open to anyone in need of a place to crash, and it seems as though anything that she had, she readily shared among her enormous friend base of struggling artists. Hadley was the heartbeat of anywhere she went, and to hear people talk about her, she seemed almost otherworldly. She was possessed of an intense magnetism that almost demanded attention, and people readily fell in line to follow her. Yet, in complete juxtaposition to this, her personality and lifestyle could not have been more unassuming. Hadley had always wanted to be a dancer, a ballerina actually, and began lessons at the age of 8. According to her mother, she practiced day and night, and while she was always skinny, she quickly developed the willowy, lithe body of a serious dancer from an early age. This petite dancer's body would continue to be one of her defining traits, and one she would often accentuate in her later days as a goth model. Years later, she could often be seen sporting waist cinches, which, when combined with her alabaster skin and utterly bizarre makeup choices, even in photographs, truly do give Hadley an otherworldly appearance. She was endlessly photogenic, though as the years wore on, if you looked at her modeling work and her personal Instagram accounts, you could begin to see the life that she had lived begin to take its toll as the small cracks and wrinkles of that life began to creep onto her otherwise immaculate face. Life had a way of kicking Cinnamon Hadley when she was down, and it seems like she had a lot of downs in her life. Though honestly, having learned what I have about her life, there's no way I would have thought she'd had it as tough as she did looking at her pictures, even in the last years of her life. Probably chief among Hadley's other trademarks was her coal black hair and clothes and nail polish, and well, you get the idea. Even when photographed in color, Cinnamon Hadley often almost appeared to be in black and white anyways. Looking at a lot of pictures of Hadley is like seeing a photograph of some little unused panel from Sandman or a shot from a short movie that doesn't exist. But this wasn't always the case. It turns out Hadley was born blonde. Though, to be fair, even before she colored her hair black, friends still described it as impossibly large. It wasn't until sometime around 1987, when she decided that she was going to become a goth, that Hadley began to take on the recognizable appearance which would soon be immortalized in the pages of one of the most highly lauded comic book series of all time. Her mother, who seems like she was infinitely supportive of a lifestyle that most people would find questionable at best, took Hadley out in 1987 and got her the requested hair dye, and said following that it was a quick descent into only buying black clothes, black hair dye, black everything. By 1989, her transformation into the Hadley that we might recognize had we run into her on the streets was complete. She was living in the basement of a rundown hovel of an apartment complex aptly nicknamed kill pigs. She shared a basement dwelling with several friends, and Hadley at one point somehow managed to convince her landlord to not only paint every wall in the apartment black and the tub blue, but she was somehow determined to find a way to dye the carpet black as well. At 20, Hadley was on her own, in another state, and living a fairly intense life. While there were fun and games, and Hadley's bubbly and magnanimous personality often fooled those around her, she was barely making ends meet. Without a constant source of income, living the bohemian artist's lifestyle, Hadley would often panhandle to get enough change for some food and coffee, which she would then eat while watching the birds in the park. It's not hard to picture the scene. Hadley beatifically perched on the edge of a water fountain in contemplative thought, sipping a cup of coffee in the morning sun, watching the birds as they fluttered around her. But Hadley had struggled with addiction as well throughout her life, and while she always seems to have been there with open arms for anyone else who needed help, there weren't always people rushing to Hadley when she needed help. These things never seemed to get her down though, and she was infinitely positive and had a way of looking at the world that I truly envy. She sought to live life in equilibrium with the world around her, to take it all in, experience and live every minute of her life to the fullest, even when things were at their hardest. She had a way of making them appear almost magical. Her electric personality, which inadvertently I think kind of commanded attention, was easy to follow. Local artists, dancers, painters, outsider artists, you name it, Hadley was friends with them all. And among these numerous friends and social acquaintances was a quiet and unassuming young comic book artist by the name of Mike Dringenberg, who couldn't help but take notice of Cinnamon Hadley and that smile. Man, that smile. Friends described her as having the most hauntingly bemusing smile, accented by her snow-white skin and diminutive frame. I've heard it described as everything from captivating to hypnotizing, and they're not kidding. One look at the picture Dringenberg used for reference reveals that same impossibly warm, knowing, and kind smile that has graced the covers of countless comics, shirts, magazines, and all manner of other merchandise. Death really is just staring back at you in the flesh. While Dringenberg did ask her permission, and several of her and her friends even watched Dringenberg draw some issues of Sandman, Hadley wouldn't learn of her likeness being used for almost a full 2 years, by which time Sandman was just starting to become the juggernaut that it is today. While Neil Gaiman and Sandman were settling in, and things were finally getting better for the now in-demand up-and-coming writer, Hadley's life was apparently anything but. The bohemian professions she'd chosen demanded a Spartan existence, seemingly almost completely bereft of worldly possessions and comfortable living conditions. In the 90s, when she made her first attempt to leave Utah, Hadley ended up stranded in the Seattle area with her former roommate, living out of her car, stealing food to eat after it broke down part of the way to their destination. When her roommate broke her ankle fleeing an angry clerk who'd given chase, they beat a hasty retreat to Utah, abandoning Hadley's car in Seattle and leaving her basically destitute once again. This was just the way things went for her, but none of it ever seemed to faze Cinnamon Hadley. This was the life she had chosen, and she was more than content. She was happy to live it. And live it she did. Every single day to the fullest, it seems. Even in her later years, it never seemed that Hadley regretted a single moment of her incredible life. And from what I can tell, she shouldn't have. Cinnamon Hadley was content to be herself, and that, I believe, that is why Death is so absolutely disarming and beguiling. There are no errors, no pretensions or presumptions or posturing or lies. There's only this being of absolute empathy in complete equilibrium with everything and everyone around them. This is the real contribution that Cinnamon Hadley made to Death of the Endless. Her empathy and generosity that translated through the talented hands of Dringenberg into one of the most enduring comic book characters in history. Dringenberg never dated Hadley or anything, but she obviously caught his eye and fascinated him enough to capture his interest. But making a lasting impression on Mike Dringenberg didn't really matter at the end of the day. Dringenberg only had so much control, and that was basically no control. What really mattered was impressing Neil Gaiman. Now, I talked about this in much more detail in part 1 of my Max video, but the original artist on Sandman, the legendary Sam Keith, absolutely suffocated by the amount of reference and concept art that Gaiman had, detailing how everyone and everything in the book was supposed to look. Gaiman had gone so far as to draw his own initial concepts, and then have Sandman cover artist Dave McKean further refine them under his guidance. Death is in fact the only member of the Endless that Neil Gaiman didn't basically design himself, but she didn't show up until issue 8, long after Keith's departure from the series. This was a matter of no little contention between Keith and Gaiman, and was one of the key factors in his decision to leave the series after only 3 issues. Gaiman had the backing of legendary editor Karen Berger, and it seems that artists had little say in what the characters looked like. Keith has famously said that despite the fact that he still gets royalty checks for Sandman, his only contribution to the series is Morpheus's helmet. When Keith left the series extremely early on, his one-time inker Mike Dringenberg stepped into the penciling duties for a time and would go on to become what I would argue is the artist most synonymous with Sandman. While both Sam Keith and Mike Dringenberg seem like really laid back and pretty quiet guys, and were actually old friends, Dringenberg was not content to simply draw versions of whatever reference Neil Gaiman was feeding him. In the dingy basement of a local apartment complex, Mike Dringenberg had found his muse. He knew what Death was supposed to look like. Now all he had to do was convince Neil Gaiman to go against his original concept for one of the main characters in a growingly successful comic book for the first time. Originally, Gaiman had given Dringenberg the visual reference of Nico for Death, specifically the cover for her Chelsea Girl album. During her prime, there was no denying the beauty or power of Nico. Her time with the Velvet Underground is a great example of just how wondrous a spectacle she could truly be. But there was a dark broodiness to her, almost an anger of sorts that lurked behind the demure appearance she often tried to put on, especially when modeling. If you look at Chelsea Girl, she appears so melancholy and distant. There is a palpable sadness and weariness to Nico. None of the things that would come to typify Sandman's interpretation of Death are found there. Dringenberg envisioned a Death that typified everything people did not think of when it came to dying. Peace, serenity, and love and understanding. Nico lived the life of a world-famous model and musician, and was afforded nearly any convenience she could conceive, while Dringenberg's muse lived in the basement of an apartment hovel and panhandled for food. There was a worldliness to Dringenberg's Death, a humility and an understanding, all inspired by Cinnamon Hadley and her magnanimous, charismatic, and captivating personality. If you look at the reference photo that Dringenberg used, it's almost impossible to argue with the fact it's just that. The reference photo. Cinnamon Hadley is so undeniably the girl who was Death, But Hadley was a somewhat erratic person according to nearly everyone she ever knew, and was continuously changing up her fashion to suit her mood. There are numerous stories that refer to Hadley's rather infamous habit of covering her face in black spider webs. Though there were other innumerable designs and symbols she scrawled upon her face from time to time, it was, from what I understand, these many strange facial designs and fashion themes which inspired the black eyeshadow designs which Death is often portrayed with. However, Hadley ironically was not the inspiration for the Ankh necklace Death wears all the time, despite the fact she was often seen sporting copious amounts of jewelry and accessories during this period. The Ankh itself was Dringenberg's own personal addition to the character. He apparently found it somewhat ironic, as the Ankh is the Egyptian symbol of life, and it came to represent immortality in many cultures that followed it. With this final piece in place, Dringenberg's model and design were firmly settled, and he submitted them to Gaiman, hoping for the best. What neither Dringenberg or Gaiman could have known was just how much closer to Gaiman's concept of Death Dringenberg was than the original simple Nico reference that he was given. As early as 1999, in the official Sandman Companion guide from Vertigo, Gaiman addressed Dringenberg's contributions and acknowledged Cinnamon Hadley as the model for Death. According to Gaiman, quote, Dringenberg had his own ideas, so he sent me a drawing based on a woman he knew named Cinnamon, unquote. Luckily for Dringenberg, and I think the rest of us as well, Gaiman said that when he initially saw the new concept art from Dringenberg, the first thing he thought was, quote, wow, this is really cool. There was something undeniably appealing about the design anyways, but interestingly, Gaiman has said that he already had a tall, dark, brooding lead character for Sandman in Morpheus. People expected Death to be an even more intense version of Morpheus, but Gaiman was interested in messing with readers' expectations from the very beginning. He'd always been taken by a tale from the Kabbalah about the angel of death. The story suggests that rather than a reaper or dark angel, Death is so beautiful that upon seeing her, you instantly fall in love and your soul literally leaves your body to be with her and you die. Given that there's only one certainty for every living organism, and that is death, this was always a comforting idea to him. And speaking more to comfort as well, Gaiman has said that the version of Death he wrote in Sandman was a sort of wish fulfillment on his part. Gaiman wanted to write something about a death he wanted to meet. Not some stuffy, brooding terror, but a beautiful and enamoring death who was good at her job and did it with humor and humbleness and grace. Mike Dringenberg's drawings of Cinnamon Hadley were all of these things personified. They were so much more than Nico or anything that Gaiman could have hoped for, and from the moment he saw the drawings, Gaiman knew they had something intensely special on their hands. Excited by the new design, Gaiman called up Sandman cover artist Dave McKean, and as they sat apart from one another at dinner in England discussing the pictures and what to do with this amazing new character, they were strangely served by a young American woman, dressed from head to toe in black, wearing a large silver Ankh medallion around her neck. For Gaiman, it was a sign, and any doubts that he might have had were out the window. From that moment on, he was fully vested in Mike Dringenberg's creation, and he always treated Death with a healthy amount of respect. And for Gaiman, this has always included acknowledging and paying tribute to Cinnamon Hadley. Death has made him a lot of money, and while I don't think Gaiman and Hadley were friends, he always went out of his way to mention her when he was asked about Death's origins, and this would become incredibly increasingly important as Sandman grew in popularity exponentially year after year. As Sandman began to become a worldwide phenomenon over the next decade, the internet came to be a real thing, and fans came together more and more to share tales and scraps of knowledge with one another. Stories began to surface about a certain Goth model who had been making the rounds for nearly a decade by the 90s, claiming she was the model for death. She'd even done so in print interviews for magazines and books. I don't really want to get off on this whole tangent and call this absolutely scum-sucking bucket of crap out by her name, because she's still working and she's still out there. And if I say her name, that just validates her negative behavior. I refuse to do that. I tracked down interviews in one book and another magazine where she directly claims to have met Neil Gaiman, who described her as a perfect visual representation of death. Whether this quote is simply taken out of context or an outright lie, the fact remains that not only has Dringenberg, the artist responsible for Death's creation, made it abundantly clear throughout the years that Hadley was the inspiration for Death, but Neil Gaiman himself has also said as much on a number of occasions. The fact that this is still in question in any way, shape, or form boggles my mind, but it is. To be fair, the model in question has taken it off of her resume. But I bring this up because by this point, it should be painfully clear. Cinnamon Hadley was Death. Nico may have been Gaiman's original visual inspiration, but Dringenberg had completely abandoned that, and Gaiman fell in love with that design he was given instead. If anything, the personality and concept of Death, as represented in the pages of Sandman, evolved as much from these drawings of Cinnamon Hadley as the reverse is true. This is why I say Cinnamon Hadley was the girl who was Death. It's the truth, and the world should know it. But why would another model make such an outlandish claim? What was there to be gained by lying about something that could be easily disproved by anyone with a Sandman companion? Well, that would be money. And Sandman was making a lot of that for everyone involved. Even just the scraps that hangers-on, like that deplorable piece of crap I was talking about, were getting were more than most people see in a lifetime. But Cinnamon Hadley wasn't involved with Sandman. She never cashed in her cards and started putting Death on her resume, and she never saw a penny. Now, don't get me wrong. Hadley never sought money, nor am I making any kind of assertion that she should have been paid. But she certainly could have cashed in. She could have gotten a few photos with Gaiman, joined the convention circuit, dressed up and charged for photos and autographs, and rode on the coattails of someone else's success. This other model definitely did, and very successfully, for a long time. Years after its initial publication, as Sandman began to really explode in popularity, when one of her friends, completely shocked to see Hadley's image in an issue, showed it to her, she just laughed a little and smiled that smile. She never bragged about it or tried using it on her resume. According to her friends, it was the kind of thing you heard from someone else, never from Hadley. In the end, perhaps she should have dipped her toe into that world, even if just a little bit. As things for Gaiman, Dringenberg, and Sandman's Death were starting to become a seriously big deal, with the hit series even getting the first ever double-page ad for a comic book in Rolling Stone, and more licensing deals than one can begin to imagine, Cinnamon Hadley's lifestyle choices were unfortunately beginning to catch up with her. The years between Dringenberg's drawings and her death were not easy. She had been accepted at one point to the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in California, but didn't receive enough scholarship money to afford living there and couldn't even attend as a result. Undeterred, She instead enrolled in Salt Lake City Community College fashion design program, where she excelled, getting straight A's. She became well known in the goth fashion world, but refusing to cash in on her death fame never quite made it. While she was a staple of any community she ever became a part of, it seems Cinnamon Hadley struggled to make a living, and as the years dragged on, her life just seemed to disintegrate. Between 2010 and 2016, her marriage ended, she lost her job, and eventually she lost her home as well. Hadley was tired. She needed a break and went for a visit to a close friend's place around the end of 2016. While they lounged about, drinking some wine and watching dance films, Hadley complained that she had been extremely tired lately. This was odd for Cinnamon Hadley, who was always possessed of what seems like an almost inexhaustible optimism and energy, no matter how hard the world tried to bring her down. During her next routine doctor's visit, at her friend's insistence, Hadley mentioned her continued fatigue and discomfort. The doctor ran a few tests, and by March of the next year, Cinnamon Hadley had been diagnosed with the advanced stages of small cell neuroendocrine carcinoma. Small cell neuroendocrine carcinoma has a 94% mortality rate. It's highly aggressive, and the cancer had been ravaging Hadley's body, who had no health insurance for God knows how long. The long-term prospects were grim, but Hadley remained optimistic until the end. With no health insurance, having spent most of her life as a semi-homeless artist, Hadley was at the mercy of those she had spent so many years taking care of. In the last years of her life, her friends and family came together to financially support her as best they could. As the disease progressed, she underwent aggressive chemo and radiation therapy throughout 2017, but the cancer continued to spread rampantly throughout her entire body. By the middle of the same year, once both chemotherapy and radiation had failed, it was clear that Cinnamon Hadley was losing her battle with cancer. The woman who had inspired Mike Dringenberg, Neil Gaiman, and so many more was quietly slipping away, and there was nothing that anyone could do about it. When her friends could no longer afford her medical costs, she was moved in with a close friend who opened his home to her. There, in a small cluttered apartment, she spent the last few months of her life, so weak that she was almost unable to speak, her petite and fragile form inexorably deteriorating. Her condition continued to worsen until December of 2017, when she was admitted to the local LDS hospital, where it was clear to close friends this was going to be Cinnamon Hadley's last hospital trip. Hadley spent 3 agonizing weeks saying goodbye to life in the hospital before passing. Despite her pain and difficulty speaking, however, Hadley reportedly graciously acknowledged every nurse, doctor, and visitor with a thank you and that smile. That marvelous, intoxicating, and disarming smile. On January 6th, 2018, Cinnamon Hadley smiled for the last time. Her light burned bright, and she will never be forgotten by those who knew her, even those who will never even know that they knew her. Those comforted by her warm smile and gracious embrace ensure that her life and legacy will live on long after her death. As Neil Gaiman said, rest in peace, or head off to your next adventure, Cinnamon Hadley. You gave Death of the Endless her face and her smile. And he's right, of course. She gave the world her all and so much more. And like Neil said, that smile. So thanks for sticking with me. I hope you don't not bothered. I got a little bit emotional with this one. It does mean a lot to me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another live video or premiere ever again. If you want to support the channel, think about signing up for my Patreon page for access to tons of behind the scenes posts, exclusive updates, uncut interviews, merchandise discount codes, and even a personal shout out on the channel. If Patreon isn't your thing but you still want to support the channel, you can also find links to my Ko-Fi page and tons of other merch like these JerkComic shirts. Thanks so much to everyone who's already supporting the channel. And speaking of which, as always, this video was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting System, as well as extremely generous grants from the patrons and Ko-Fi members that you see on the screen now. I'd like to personally thank my loyal Wednesday Warriors, Super Chasen, David Arroyo, Mike Dolan, Roland Katsuragi, and Mike Dolan again. Also, major shout out to Weapon X Squall for the hopefully much improved audio from here on out, for his amazing donation. I appreciate you as always, brother. Hope this is less painful on the ears. I seriously could not do these videos without the help of every one of you amazing, wonderful boils and ghouls, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. Thanks again for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. And as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops. Keep reading comics.